I just finished watching Daredevil Born Again, and it was a blast. And every time I watch something about Daredevil, I find myself wondering the same thing. How does he do that?
How did you just do that?
Okay, let me explain. So Daredevil loses his sight as a kid because of a chemical accident, but in return, his other senses get supercharged. After tons of hardcore training, he learns to master these senses and becomes the crime-fighting hero we know as Daredevil. But what exactly does heightened senses mean? For Daredevil, it means using his other senses at their absolute peak. He can hear things from far away, detect heartbeats, and even sense changes in air pressure and vibrations, which helps him understand the shape and movement of objects. He can do everything we do with sight and even more using only his other senses. The best way to describe it? Radar senses. He can scan his surroundings in an instant, picking up on anything with a frequency, vibration, sound, or scent. This allows him to feel the world in a way no one else can. Imagine walking into a room and instantly knowing the layout, how many people are there, and even getting a sense of their emotions just from their heartbeats. His mind processes all this information in real time, which keeps him a step ahead of everyone. But the thing is, superpowers can be tricky. If you think outside the box, you might come up with ways to use a character's abilities that the writers never imagined, or even spot loopholes that make them a lot easier to beat. Daredevil's powers are no exception. In some situations, they're incredibly useful in ways you wouldn't expect, like how he can detect lies through heartbeats during interrogations, while in others they can be a surprising weakness. So let's break down the scenarios where Daredevil's abilities give him the upper hand, and the ones where they might turn against him. I think the most valuable thing about Daredevil's abilities isn't his strength or fighting skills, it's information. Being able to tell when someone is lying, picking up on their emotions, it's a power that opens up way more doors than just winning fights. And we've seen him do this time and time again. Like in the last episode, Matt asked Hector Ayala if he was hiding something, and just from the way Hector's heartbeat sped up and his body tensed, Matt knew he was lying. When he looked into it more, he found out that Hector was actually White Tiger. Later, he used that information in court and won the case, something no one else could have done the way he did. We saw the same kind of thing in She-Hulk. Using just his sense of smell, Daredevil figured out that the plaintiff had used the wrong fuel in their equipment, which got the case thrown out. These are the kinds of details only Daredevil can catch, turning small clues into huge advantages. Honestly, if Daredevil were a detective instead of a lawyer, he'd probably be even better at delivering justice. He could listen to the way criminals respond, pick up on the tiniest details, and use that to uncover new evidence. With the right approach, he could even push them into confessing their crimes without ever needing to throw a punch. Beyond that, informational advantage extends to combat scenarios too. In a fight, knowing exactly where his enemies are, what they're doing, even where they're looking, it gives him a massive stealth advantage. He could slip through a room full of enemies, take them out one by one, and disappear without anyone even realizing he was there. Another example of this is when he appeared in She-Hulk. Just by listening to their heartbeats, he instantly figured out exactly how many goons were in the warehouse and where each of them was.
There are 25 goons in the building. 7 below us, 8 in the front, and 10 in the hallway.
But of course, in a more balanced fight, these advantages aren't as overwhelming as in the scenarios I described earlier. Sure, Daredevil has insane awareness, but he's still bound by his physical limits. He might be able to sense a punch coming, but dodging it still requires agility and reflexes, and that I think is his biggest weakness. No matter how fit or strong he is, Daredevil doesn't have superhuman speed or strength. He's capped by the peak of human physical ability. And on top of that, all the energy he burns during fights or chases actually weakens his heightened senses. Think about it. When you're running or fighting, your body starts prioritizing oxygen for your muscles instead of your brain. Ever notice how when your heart is pounding, your vision blurs a little or your awareness feels off? The same thing happens to Daredevil. The more exhausted he gets, the more his body redirects oxygen away from his senses, dulling his abilities. And that brings me to another idea. Daredevil shouldn't be fighting hand-to-hand. Sure, he's got insane combat skills, but his true strength isn't in throwing punches. It's in the information he gathers about his surroundings. So, why fight at all? Instead of taking the physical route, Daredevil could use his advantage of information to disable his enemies without ever needing to land a punch. Imagine this. He's in a dark room, surrounded by enemies. Instead of charging in and risking exhaustion, he could use his radar senses to find the perfect moment to take them out, quietly, strategically, with no need for a direct confrontation. One way he could do this? Stealth tactics, just like Batman. Imagine if Batman had Daredevil's senses. He already stalks criminals from the shadows, using fear and strategy to take them down one by one. Now, picture that with Daredevil's ability to hear heartbeats, sense air pressure changes, and detect movement without sight. He wouldn't just be an expert at ambushes, he'd be unstoppable. Daredevil should lean into that same approach. Instead of exhausting himself in hand-to-hand combat, he could use his radar sense to track enemies, wait for the perfect moment, and take them out silently, whether with something like sleeping darts, well-placed distractions, or precise, non-lethal strikes. The less he fights, the sharper his senses stay, making him even deadlier in the long run. It's the perfect strategy for him. His ability to sense precise locations and mental states would make him an unbeatable stealth operative. Why tire himself out with hand-to-hand combat when he has the option to disable his enemies without ever laying a finger on them? But there's one more crucial weakness we need to talk about: direct damage to his head. It all depends on his senses working together in perfect harmony. But what happens when that system gets disrupted? We've actually seen a similar vulnerability exploited before in another superhero universe. Remember in The Boys when Homelander deliberately clapped his hands next to Blindspot's ears with devastating force? In an instant, Blindspot went from being an enhanced blind hero to someone completely disoriented and defenseless. This wasn't just a shocking moment for viewers, it's a perfect illustration of the exact vulnerability Daredevil has. His enhanced hearing, which is crucial to his radar sense, could potentially be neutralized by the right sound-based attack, leaving him genuinely blind rather than just technically sightless with superhuman compensation. If someone were to exploit this weakness, whether through a strong hit to his head, a burst of loud noise, or even a well-placed slap to the ears, they could instantly transform his greatest strength into his greatest vulnerability, make him truly blind rather than enhanced. And this isn't just theoretical. We've seen this vulnerability exposed directly in the show. When Matt takes significant head trauma, his radar sense essentially malfunctions. In these moments, his ability to perceive his surroundings becomes distorted or disappears altogether, leaving him truly vulnerable. During Daredevil Season 3, after suffering serious injuries in the Midland Circle collapse, his senses became unpredictable and unreliable for extended periods. We see similar effects whenever he encounters flashbangs, sonic weapons, or even just absorbs a precisely placed strike to the head. These moments reveal how fragile his sensory advantage really is, and how quickly it can be neutralized by opponents who understand his weakness. Daredevil is an incredible fighter, but he's not invincible. A smart enemy wouldn't try to beat him in combat, they'd go after his ears. When you think about it, it's clear. Daredevil can't just rely on his fighting skills. He needs to think strategically and use his powers to outmaneuver his opponents. His abilities give him access to more information than almost anyone else in the Marvel Universe, and the way he uses that information is what makes him so dangerous. He can tell when someone is lying, pick up on emotions, and navigate environments in ways no one else can. But at the same time, he's also limited by his physical endurance and the delicate balance of his heightened senses. If he overexerts himself, or if someone targets his ears and disrupts his radar sense, he can be left completely vulnerable. That's why the best version of Daredevil wouldn't be someone constantly engaging in hand-to-hand combat, but someone who leans into his strengths: stealth, strategy, and tactical awareness. He could outmaneuver his enemies before they even realize what's happening, using his radar sense to strike with precision instead of brute force. Because at the end of the day, Daredevil's greatest weapon isn't his fists, it's his mind. By thinking ahead, using his environment, and staying one step ahead of his enemies, he could become even more formidable than he already is. And if he ever fully embraced that side of himself, well, the streets of Hell's Kitchen would never be the same again. Thank you so much for making this far. If you liked my content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. I always take great joy in reading your comments and thoughts. See you next time.